Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Marche, the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. Before we introduce our guests and get started, I do need to do a bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting, are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. We're thrilled to bring you this educational presentation today. Attendees are muted, but we encourage you to ask questions using the chat box. The presenter will answer those queries during or after the webinar today as appropriate. And if we don't have a chance to get to your question during the event, we'll make sure someone reaches out to you after today's event. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. I'd like to introduce you to today's moderator. Daniel Baumgartner is the founding partner of Terra Nova Asset Management, LLC. Prior to the firm's founding, Mr. Baumgartner was responsible for marketing, development of special U.S. investment products, as well as customer acquisition and relationship management in the asset management department of Commerzbank Capital Markets Corporation, New York, as vice president. After receiving his Bachelor of Science degree in Finance and International Business from New York University in 1983, he started his professional career at Swiss Bank Corporation, New York, in corporate finance, and later moved to the correspondent banking area in Zurich. In 1989, he joined Deutsche Bank AG New York, where he was responsible for U.S. cash management products and services. And Daniel, go ahead and say hello so we can see your face and tell us a little bit what you're going to be doing today.
Yes, well, thank you very much for being here, and feel free to ask questions in the chat. I will be moderating those questions today for you.
Excellent. I would like to introduce you to today's presenter. Josh Kanter earned a bachelor's degree in economics and political science from Emory and earned a Doctor of Law degree in 1987 from the University of Chicago. Following several years in the legal space, Josh decided to focus on his family business, where he currently serves as president of Chicago Financial, Inc., a single-family office overseeing a complex organization of trusts, investment, and philanthropic entities for a multi-branch and multi-generational family. Through Josh Kanter Wealth Advisory Services, Josh's goal is to provide thoughtful, personalized family, business, and legal consulting services to his clients. Josh, I'm going to stop my share here and turn the time over to you so that we can get started. And I did put you on mute for a second. You'll need to come off of mute and then share your screen. There we go. And you'll have to come off of mute.
Yep, okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Marche. Thank you, Daniel, as well. I really am excited about this webinar today. Marche obviously just gave you guys a little bit of background on me, but I'll throw that in a tiny bit, mostly just so you understand where and how I come to the particular work we're going to talk about today, which I hope you guys find as exciting and interesting as I do. I was a lawyer, as Marche indicated. I practiced primarily in transactional work and venture capital work. My family was involved in the venture capital space, and my dad happened to be a world-renowned trust and estate lawyer, and so I kind of had this whole transactional part of my life, and then I had this whole kind of by osmosis trust and estate part of my life. And when my dad passed away, I had the opportunity to come in and set up our single-family office to continue what Marche also described as a multi-branch, multi-generational family enterprise. And that kind of got me into the work that I do today, which has now been going on for about 20 years for our family. And quite a number of years of doing this with other families as well and helping them kind of go down that path. So that's sort of how I come to this, both as a sort of academic student of this work and also as a family member, having been involved in it very directly. So I won't bother reading all of this on the screen about my background. Obviously, you can look me up if you care, but that's really how I come to this. That didn't go forward. There we go. This is intended to be part one of a multi-part series, certainly at least two, that we're hopefully going to do, assuming I get invited back to do part two. What I really like to talk about and what we're going to talk about today is sort of everything to do with your wealth that has nothing to do with the money, at least not managing the money per se. A lot of people refer to this as the soft side, depending upon what you've read about this kind of part of the work that we're talking about in leaving a legacy. Think about this as your non-financial wealth planning, the emotional side of wealth planning. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. How do you think about leaving a legacy? How do you think about what you really want your descendants to, what you want your heirs to really inherit beyond just the wealth, and hence the title of today's webinar. Today, as I said, we're gonna really break this up into a couple of different webinars. Today's topics are really what you see here. I want to talk a little bit about what is this idea of family dynamics, governance, and education. Why does it really matter? What are the areas of risk that families typically are really looking at? And then the core to really this whole idea of family dynamics, governance, and education, in my mind, is at its core is this idea of the family meeting. And some of you may be doing that, some of you may be thinking about it, some of you may have never thought about that before. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is, and particularly the topics I want to touch on today, although these are obviously just the surface of what family meetings typically cover, are listed here. This idea of values and purpose, planning considerations, family capital, fairness and equity, responsible ownership, roles and responsibilities, and governance. So we'll get into those in a little bit. To me, I think a lot of the work, when you read about or think about the area of family dynamics, governance, and education, is often associated with single-family offices. And in part, that's because, frankly, there's people like me and my family who are paid to wake up every day and think about this stuff. But I really like to think about this, and I hope you will, in the context of what it means to think like a family office, that you don't need to be a family office. And obviously in today's environment, the numbers have gotten so big. When people ask me, how big do you need to be to have a single family office? The numbers are really large. And so while you may have those numbers, it often is just as interesting for people to think about what it means to think like a family office. And by that, I really mean that you're being deliberate and thoughtful about some of these topics that we're going to talk about and that I just sort of listed for you today. And that also means, in my view, that there are different things that can be catalysts to thinking like a family office. It doesn't have to be just because there's a certain size of a pile of money around. It can be for lots of other reasons. So you'll see here some of the things, obviously not an exhaustive list, that I personally think are really these catalysts to thinking like a family office. Maybe it's familial complexity. Maybe you have a blended family that has different relationships involved and different families that have come together, and how do you think about that complexity and how do you take that forward? Maybe it's structural complexity. That's actually very much what drove us to have to create a family office, was my dad's history as a trust and estate lawyer. We were battling a 30-year, what ultimately was a 30-year tax case. We were filing 750 tax returns a year. We were doing lots of things that had tremendous complexity and required us to think more like a family office. Maybe it's asset and liability complexity. Maybe you own a business and there are different family members who are shareholders or on the board or management. All of these things can obviously create different kinds of complexity that make people think like a family office. So there's a few others on here I won't bother you with right now. Why does this matter? And that, I think, becomes also a really important issue. It matters to me because too many times families are really defined by their financial wealth. And of course, that's not really what we are. Financial wealth helps allow us to do other things. But at the end of the day, we're still a family. We're looking at the legacy we're trying to create, the multi-generational impact maybe we're trying to create, whatever that is, but it goes beyond the financial wealth. So I think we have to think about this in the context of what it means to be successful as a multi-generational family of wealth. The other issue with this, really from my perspective, is that we typically leave a lot of these lessons and discussions for somebody else. Maybe it's like sex ed in high school, and we're hoping the teachers will teach our kids about sex ed. The reality is personal finance is only taught in a fraction of high schools around the country. And personal finance, of course, is only touching the surface of the kinds of things that we have to talk about in this idea of multi-generational family wealth and success. And so it's, I frankly think, our responsibility as wealth owners, as wealth creators, as in this space to teach our heirs what it means to be responsible stewards of that wealth as we hand it down to them. In looking at that, then there's a guy who many of you may have read or read about, Dennis Jaffe. He's a leading thought leader in this particular space. I like this framework that he uses, that he says we're really moving, when you have these conversations about family dynamics, governance, and education, you're really moving from this idea of this paternalistic family structure over to this partnership structure. And you can see it here on different lines. We're going from a patriarchy to working as a team, from suspicious to trust, from opportunistic to professional, from passive heirs to engaged heirs. And that's one of the real key ones from my perspective, right? From closed and secretive to very transparent. So this is an evolution of maybe a top-down family structure to a more flattened out hierarchy where everybody is involved in appropriate ways, of course, but where everybody is involved in some of these conversations. A lot of what this is about is avoiding risks to the family and risks to what multi-generational success can look like. And we're all familiar with the financial management side of this. I'm sure all of you have plenty of advisors who will talk to you about the financial management risks, whether that's investment risk, whether that's an operating business and management risk, whatever that is that kind of sits in that yellow bubble up at the top. What far fewer people are really interested in talking about, and happens to be where my passion lies, is this idea of talking about the blue bubble here, blind spots in planning. Really, what are you not thinking of? What are you not seeing in your, whether that's in your formal planning or whether it's in this idea, again, of preparing heirs? And over on the green side there, just what are the risks that are associated with family and legacy? We've all read the horror stories in the newspaper about families that blow up and the things that cause those things. So we're trying to avoid as many of those as possible. It becomes important because you may have seen this very famous study by Williams and Presser. It's been written about in a book called Preparing Heirs, and you can find it all over the place. But what's fascinating about it is if you look at the causes, or what they looked at were the causes of families losing their wealth, kind of the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves proverb coming true, losing their wealth involuntarily. So that might mean a family feud, it might mean a bankruptcy, it might mean a forced sale of a company, it can mean all kinds of different things. But the involuntary loss of their wealth. And what were the causes of that? And what they found in this study was that 60% of families that lost their wealth was the result of a lack of trust and communication. Another 25%, the lack of education and preparation of heirs. And only 3% really related to a lack of financial and tax planning. Well, of course, if you think about where we all spend our time, the vast majority of our time goes into thinking about financial and tax planning. Now, maybe there's a little bit of causation that's why that number is so low, but it still means there's 85% of these situations where there's a loss of family wealth that relate to the things that we're talking about today. When you engage in this work, if you choose to engage in this work, I like to remind people this is long-term work. This is not we have a meeting and we're done. There's the story that was told through a book by a guy named Jay Hughes, who's also very famous in this space, for those of you who may have read some of his books. And he uses the story, and I really love the story because it's a perfect analogy of why this is long-term work. So he tells this story you can see here that's supposedly about one of Napoleon's generals, and he's out looking at his property, and he talks to his gardener, and he says to his gardener, "I don't see a copper beech tree." And the gardener says, "Well, Mon General, the copper beech tree takes 150 years to grow." And the general says to the gardener, "Well, then we better get started right away." And that's, I think, how I look at this whole notion of family dynamics, governance, and education. It's never too early to start, and it's never too late to stop. It just goes forever. It's the families that are the most successful, if you look throughout history, of the families that are most successful that perpetrate or maintaining their multi-generational wealth and success as families that stay together, it's long-term work. So I encourage you to keep that in mind as you think about this. As I said earlier, to me, the family meeting is really the core of this work. And I've got listed here lots and lots of things that are typical to come up in the family meeting. Some families like to meet monthly. Some families meet quarterly. Some families meet maybe once a year or every other year. It really depends, obviously, on what you're trying to accomplish, how quickly you're trying to accomplish it. Where is everybody in their stage of life, right? This makes a big difference whether kids are in college or kids are all launched or kids are 10 years old. All of these things are factors in maybe deciding how much time can everybody devote to this. And that'll certainly have an impact on the speed at which all of this can happen. But these are lots of things that come up. I'm going to focus today only on that earlier list that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. But you're thinking about things like family communication, again, fairness and equity, responsible wealth owners and responsible engaged ownership, identifying a shared purpose, lots of things that you can see here on the screen. So I'm going to dive in and talk specifically about a few of these. One of the things that I really like to do with families when I get started with them, and I think is pretty typical in the industry, is the idea of really looking at a family's value system. And the process that I like to go through with this is typically using this set of cards. You may have seen them. These also actually come from Dennis Jaffe, who I mentioned earlier. They're a set of cards called Values Edge. And the idea is you sit down with this big stack of cards and everybody individually sits down and creates their own pyramid. And you can see one of the pyramids here. And the pyramid idea is to put your top value at the top and you slowly look down at the different values that you as an individual hold. By the way, there's another great set of cards from a group called 2164 that is, I think, particularly well suited to when you're looking at values in the context of philanthropy. But these are ones that I really like to use when we're talking about things about family purpose and things like that. So you get this pyramid put together. It's a pyramid of your own personal values, and then there's a second part of the exercise where you go through and try to combine these, and you find that you're determining what the family values are. And what I think is interesting about this, and I'll talk about this as we get a little bit further into the presentation today, is how that can affect then looking back at some of your planning. That all of a sudden I find that I'm having a conversation with a family who says, well, education is really, really important, and maybe grandma and grandpa or mom and dad were able to put us all through school and we all walked out of school without any debt, and what a gift that was, and we want to perpetuate that gift. And yet nobody has thought about that in the context of their trust planning or their financial planning. And so it's not equating our values to that planning side. I often also say that in the work that I do, I'm not holding a successful family meeting, or at least a series of family meetings, if somebody isn't laughing and somebody isn't crying. It just is by nature what happens in these meetings. And so I had a family I was working with last year. Tradition became a really important value through both generations that were in this meeting. And the mom started crying. And we couldn't figure out why she was crying. And so we all said, well, why are you so upset by that? And she said, well, I don't feel like I've done enough to really foster these traditions for our family. We don't do Thanksgiving together. We don't really necessarily have big holiday plans together. And the kids stopped her and said, no. What we mean by that is every time we come home from school or now out in our jobs, we go to the same 3 restaurants. We do the same things as a family. And that was what tradition meant to them. And so they were able to come together as a family and understand that by talking about these things, they actually all had a very shared love and purpose around, these traditions, but they just defined it differently. And it was really kind of a special moment for that family.
Before we move on,
yeah.
Daniel, I think you probably should have gotten some questions that came up, and I thought we might want to address those.
Right. So here's a question. Yeah, here's a quick question. Who should attend these family meetings? Only decision makers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to talk about that a little bit further down when we get to talking about what I will have in here about a slide called engaged ownership. But I would answer that's a very personal and individual family decision. I know families that will say it's frankly a bloodline only. I know families that will say it's only decision makers. I know families that say, I'll tell you, my family made a decision very, very early on. The spouses were no different than blood, and the 6 of us are involved in every decision that's made at that level. All 7 of our grandkids, or what my parents' grandkids, have been involved in these meetings. So really, I think you have to think about the content that's being shared. Obviously, if you have a 10-year-old, maybe you're not revealing everything about the family's balance sheet, but maybe you want the 10-year-old to understand something about philanthropy. Maybe if it's a boardroom decision, and I'm going to come and talk about that actually in a little while, that it's really only board members. So you've got to think about that a little bit on your own, but I think there's no right or wrong answer. I would encourage more transparency than less. I personally have a pretty strong view that, for example, excluding spouses is a very dangerous precedent, but that may be appropriate at the beginning of a family meeting process and slowly find ways to bring them in as trust is built or depending upon what the concerns might be. So it's a very individualized answer, I'd say.
Yeah, there's another follow-up to the beginning of the meetings. Would the cards with the values be an activity for the first meeting?
I like it very early. For me, I often use it as a first meeting. And I will say in the family meeting context, it's typically a lot easier to run these family meetings to have a facilitator in the room with you. It's very difficult to run these yourself as a family member. And primarily, I'll say that also will come to a slide I'm going to talk about in a minute, but that as a family member, it's pretty hard, right? It's a hard characteristic to have, or a rare characteristic to have, to be able to kind of check your ego and check your own opinion at the door and not have that influence the way you're running these conversations and things like that. But the values exercise, yeah, I think it comes up very early because it really permeates lots of different things. It can certainly permeate this idea of developing, which I'm about to get to, but developing a family values statement or a shared purpose statement, or even some families go as far as a mission statement or a family constitution. Those are things that are pretty hard to put together without having the basis of understanding some of this values work. And the values work then goes to think about how much more effective some of your other advisors can be if they understand the family's values. How much more effective can your estate planner be if they understand that the family values education or entrepreneurship, or some of these things can be built into these trust structures or into the family's planning? How much more effective can, quite frankly, a trustee be if they're included or if they're aware of the family's values? So I find it's really helpful to have early, because then it'll keep raising its head and it'll keep coming back.
Okay, that's it for questions right now.
Okay. And please keep interjecting with questions. It's really great. I'm sorry I'm talking so fast. I have a lot of ground to cover today, so I hope that's okay.
That's all right. And if we have to go a little over, that's all right too.
Okay. As I started to say here also, some of the value stuff often comes into this idea of developing a purpose statement, or whether that's a wealth purpose statement, whether it's a mission statement, it doesn't really matter. Or even just defining what the family believes are some of the legacy ideals they want to leave behind. Excuse me. It's something that I think really helps a family focus on what is their shared purpose. If there's a shared purpose, and by the way, you can see at the bottom of this slide, it says it's okay if there's no shared purpose. I mean, I think I've seen many, many families who get together and say, you know what, this is just about the money, and we don't have a shared purpose. But if there is a shared purpose, whatever that may be, and there's lots of different ways of looking at that, how do we want to look at being good stewards of our assets? How do we want to look at what are the non-financial returns and objectives of our assets? And you can see on here, maybe that's education, maybe it's developing our human and intellectual capital, something else that I'll talk about. Maybe it's collective philanthropy. Maybe it's common investments or business interests. All of these different things can go into what those shared purposes are, and how do we take that set of values that we're talking about and translate that into a shared purpose. The other place where I really like families to focus on this idea of their values is, again, kind of aligning your values with your planning. And part of that is what I said earlier, is maybe education is an important value that we want to plan around. But the other thing that I find too many people quite honestly fail to realize is that there's really only three buckets here that we're talking about filling when we're talking about our planning, right? There's a family bucket, and that bucket may have lots of sub-buckets, but the reality is it's how much of what I've created am I trying to leave to my family? There's how much am I trying to do philanthropically or leave to charity? And there's how much do I feel like paying to the Internal Revenue Service? And if you're like most people, you probably want to minimize what's going into that bucket. You don't have to, but you certainly can. And making sure that your planning is really focused on how do I want to fill these buckets, and is it as thoughtful and deliberate as I want to be so there are no surprises. Sometimes that might mean the use of insurance. Sometimes it might mean, different trust planning or whatever. But whatever it is making sure that your value set is really aligned in that planning. So the next big topic I really want to talk about that often is coming up in this context of family meetings and families in general is using the family's financial capital to really build on its human, social, and intellectual capital. And if you've read anything about this kind of soft side of the space, you'll see these buzzwords all over the place. People use them slightly differently, but in my view, it doesn't really matter. They're all pretty similar. The idea of human capital is who are we? What do we bring to the table? Your social capital is kind of who are my networks? Where can I call on to benefit the family? And your intellectual capital is probably more your formal education. Am I a doctor? Am I a lawyer? Am I a trained something, whatever it is? And how do I look at that? And not only is it important to think about how is the family going to use its financial capital to build on these things, but to realize that we often, very often in family situations, there's a tendency to freeze people in a moment in time. And quite frankly, the typical moment in time is when they leave the house or when they leave each other. And so you'll see parents looking at children who left for college, perhaps, or whenever they left the house, and they're frozen in that moment in time. That's what those kids know. That's who they are. They're baked into that particular thing. And then we're not giving enough credit for the fact that they've now become real live adults. And they're out there doing things, and they're out there learning things. And they have their own human capital to bring back to the family table. Similarly, siblings often do this with each other because, of course, again, whether it's college or whatever other reason, they're leaving the house. They're no longer living under the same roof. Maybe they're moving across the country, across the world. It doesn't really matter, but they're not seeing each other. I had a family recently who the younger son said to me that the older daughter was finally, he's on a medical track, and the older daughter was finally turning to him and starting to ask him. He was no longer just the little brother. He was now the little brother with medical knowledge. And so she started calling him and asking him medical questions. And it was really a great thing to see her be open to this fact that her little brother is now, he's got his own human capital that he can bring to it. And the other thing I think is really important, I love this quote. It's attributed to Albert Einstein. I don't know if it really is him or not, but I love the idea that we have to look at everybody in the family unit as having their own human capital and not measuring it against somebody else or against some preconceived notion of what people should know. And the quote, obviously, as you can read, is everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. And I think that's a really important idea to make sure that we're thinking about whether you're dealing with, a teacher and an investment banker, whether you're dealing with an artist and a lawyer, it doesn't matter. We're looking at what is the capital that they bring to the table from their knowledge, and I'll give you some examples of that as we go on. So again, there's just kind of this overlapping circles of your human, social, financial, and intellectual capital that I think it's really important that families talk about. Another big topic that families often have to address is this idea of fairness and equity. And typically that even starts fraught with everybody really reading into these things very differently and what those words mean. But for me, I think a couple of concrete examples to give you just the way to think about this is maybe you've got a set of parents who want to help their kids with housing, and they have two kids, and they've got a son who wants to be a teacher in downtown San Francisco, and they have a daughter who's an investment banker in Des Moines, Iowa. In fairness, I don't know that there are any investment bankers in Des Moines, but let's assume that there are, and the cost of living there is pretty cheap. What's fair and what's equitable? Is it helping them equally? Is it recognizing that their salaries are radically different, their earning power is radically different, and they're living in radically different cost of living centers of the country? Similarly, let's say grandma and grandpa or mom and dad want to help the grandkids with college. Does it matter that one of their kids has one kid who's going to state school and the other has 3 kids going to private colleges? Is that fair? Is it equitable? Those are the kinds of things that families have to really think through. And I think one of the things that's interesting about it, and you'll see here if you had this presentation, it's actually linked, but go ahead and Google it sometime. There's this experiment that was done with monkeys. And the idea was that the lab assistants had 2 monkeys in these 2 glass enclosures so they could see each other, and they would give each monkey a piece of cucumber. Apparently monkeys really like cucumber. And so they'd give them a piece of cucumber, and the monkey had to go like ring a bell or something, come back and get another piece of cucumber. And so they would do this kind of routinely, right? It was very easy, and it was really cute, and it's really fun to watch. And all of a sudden, on one monkey, they start to give him green grapes. Well, as much as monkeys apparently like cucumber, they really like green grapes. And so they start giving one monkey green grapes. Well, the other monkey sees, because these are glass enclosures, sees that, wait a second, that monkey is getting green grapes. And he literally starts throwing the cucumber back at the lab assistant. And it's really hysterical. But it shows this idea, in my view, that the idea of fairness and equity is really innate, right? This is not a learned behavior. This is something that we're just sort of born with to look and say, that's not fair. And so when we see families of wealth, there are all kinds of places where that plays out. But go Google that experiment and you'll be amused by it, I think. Sort of going back a little bit to that, one of those earlier questions, the next 2 things I want to talk about are really this idea of responsible ownership and roles and responsibilities. Responsible ownership, I'd say, is something that goes back even to that financial education or that personal finance in high school. It's how do we become responsible owners? How do we become responsible stewards of the wealth that we're being given or the business that we're shepherding or whatever it is that we're doing? What's required for that? And so this isn't necessarily the list that's applicable to every family, but understanding the family's history, their values, their culture, having a basic financial education, understanding my legal duties. If I'm a trustee or if I'm a beneficiary of a trust, I need to understand my legal responsibilities in those roles. How do I learn competent decision-making? How do I understand the roles that different family members play? All of these things that go into becoming a responsible owner or a good steward of the wealth that I'm being left to steward. And how do I obtain those? Some people obtain those by joining other boards or by taking programs or just by reading books or by their education. But there's so many aspects of this that you have to be thinking about, how do I get all of my family members to get the appropriate level of that education? Sort of related to that is this idea of roles and responsibilities. And this is also something that I typically try to do with families fairly early because it comes up pretty often. The story I really love here again from another book is a father and a son having a conversation. The father quite literally has 2 different hats, and he puts on his boss hat to his son who works in the business, and he says, "Son, you're fired." And then he takes off his boss hat and he puts on his father hat and he says, "Son, Mom and I just heard you've been fired and lost your job. What can we do to help?" And I think it goes again to this really great idea of making sure that when we're communicating with each other as family members, it's not always mom and daughter or mom and son or dad and daughter, whatever it is, right? We have these complicated relationships that are intertwined, and we have to be thinking about and cognizant of the roles, the hats that we're wearing. And when families do this with literal hats, it's kind of funny, but even if it's just acknowledging, this is the hat I'm wearing. I had a situation recently, actually, that was very similar to this, where a family, a dad is the majority owner of a business the son works for, and the son has now been demoted 3 times, and they've had to have a very conscious conversation about the roles that they're in when they're having that conversation. I had another situation recently that I thought was also very interesting, where a mom bought an apartment for a college-age son and a roommate. And when the roommate was late on rent, the mom was charging the roommate a late fee on his rent, like any landlord would. the son came back and said, Mom, why are you doing this? Like, we can afford this and he can't, and this is really mean and you're being mean. And the mom said, no, you have to understand, I'm wearing my hat as a landlord. I'm not your mother in this context. And that's what a landlord would do. And that's what this roommate has to learn, is that he's got this financial obligation and he must learn to stick with it. So again, it's just this idea of understanding these roles and responsibilities.
Josh,
Yeah.
a couple of questions from the audience.
Great.
One is, how do you resolve conflict when it comes to issues of family and equality? Does it make sense to change the priorities of family values over time? For example, the third generation wants to shift the focus of the family wealth more towards education as opposed to something else.
Wow, we could spend a lot of time on that one. It's a great and fascinating question, and I think for today, the easiest thing I can say is the more of this work that a family engages in, the easier that conversation becomes. But it's a really hard conversation, and those shifts are back to even the earlier question of who's in the room, who are the decision makers. So maybe that's going to come a little bit to my next area, which is really about this idea of family governance. But it's hard, right? I mean, you've got to decide, do you have dictates from the top? Do you have a consensus building around what those things mean? Frankly, even some of those questions, particularly, I think Daniel, you mentioned fairness and equity in there as well, and that can be looked at very differently when, for example, mom and dad are alive versus when mom and dad are not, and not there to be making that. Because a lot of people will respond that, oh, well, if mom and dad are doing this for Pete and this for Sue, that's okay, because that's sort of their decision. But once this is now Pete and Sue's decision, maybe that's not okay. And so those fairness and equity decisions may change based on who's involved and who really has access, and what are the values that have been set out, and how do you look at that? I know that's not a very concrete answer to the question. It's a hard question to answer in a short time, but it's a great question, an important one. You going?
Yes.
Okay. So the last of these big family meeting topics that I wanted to touch on today is this idea of governance, and I think much to the question that you just read, there's a whole continuum when you're thinking about governance of formal and informal. So I like to, again, this is somebody else's framework. I really liked how it simplified the kind of continuum in the framework. What's the issue? Who is family, which goes back to that conversation of, and the next one, who's at the table, which table, and who has those decision rights. And you can think about that in all kinds of contexts. But again, I really like the way that this just walks through. Is this a decision that's being made in the study? Are we moving to the kitchen table and maybe having a little bit more of a family consensus discussion? Are we at the dining room table? Maybe this is a little bit more formal and we're kind of reaching some kind of family compact around something. Are we at a conference table? Or are we at the boardroom when we're getting to really formal governance structures? And so thinking about all of those different, like how formal or informal that is. And you can see it in a different way, thinking about, are we talking about a holiday or birthday party at one end? Well, that's pretty easy. There's not a lot of hurt feelings if things maybe there are, not a lot of hurt feelings, hopefully, if things aren't, decided in a particular way, all the way down to how are we allocating our wealth? How are we dealing with employment decisions within a family business? How are we dealing with health and life care decisions? Those are pretty serious. So how do you look at that continuum of decisions? And that turns back to this idea that I started to mention earlier of engaged ownership, which I would view very differently than responsible ownership. Responsible ownership to me, again, is kind of this idea of stewardship. Engaged ownership is how do we engage everybody in the family in an age and skill set appropriate way. Sometimes people are just thinking about that of what's the skill set and what are the requirements needed to come work in the family office or to come work in the family business. Do you need to go work in an outside business of a similar industry? Do you need to have a particular education? All these kinds of things. But the other side of engaged ownership is understanding sort of the legal framework and kind of rubric around which this is all built. So if I'm the beneficiary of a trust that is a shareholder in a business, what's my decision-making power? What are my rights and obligations as a beneficiary? Well, now if I'm the trustee of that trust, or I'm that trust, and now I am a direct shareholder, I have a different set of responsibilities. And if I'm on the board of the company, I have a very different set of responsibilities. And if I'm a manager of the company, I have yet another set of responsibilities. So how do we look at family decision-making, whether it's a business, whether it's family policies that are being decided on? How do we look at that? And going back to that very early question, who's in the room? What's the table? How are those decisions made? And it's a complicated thing, but it's important to get people to, it sort of also goes back to the hats, right? Am I here as a manager? Am I here as a board member? Am I here as a shareholder? Am I here as a beneficiary? What am I here as? And therefore, what is my decision-making power? And how do we engage in joint decision-making? And this can get as complicated as you want. For multi-generational, multi-branch families, this might look something like this, where you have kind of a formal or informal family council at the top of this, which is, I'd say in our case, this is the 6 of us at my generational level with spouses who are making these broad philosophic decisions, down to what does the family office do? On the philanthropy side, obviously a very formal structure to meet all the corporate and philanthropic and internal revenue service guidelines, and maybe over on the operating side, who's really qualified to be over there, and how do you put people in these different boxes and have them have the authority that they want in the governance sense. So I'm going to stop there. I hope there's some more questions. As we get to what we think about is part 2 of this series, again, assuming I'm invited back, I hope so. We're going to talk a little bit about financial literacy. Excellent. We'll talk about financial literacy and what does that really mean, and how do you bring everybody into, again, I would say, an appropriate level of financial literacy. I think, I work with families where maybe there's, again, an investment banking person in the family. That person's going to have a different level of investment knowledge than the artist. And the artist may go acquire a certain amount of financial literacy so that he or she can be at the table having a conversation, but they're probably going to use different language. They're going to have a different level of knowledge about it. So how do we bring everybody into this kind of ecosphere with just the amount of financial literacy and different topic sets that they need? And so we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about this idea of identifying blind spots. How do you step back with your advisors, by yourself? How do you step back and look at, what am I missing? What am I not thinking of? Or what do I know needed to get done that I didn't do? And ultimately, we'll also talk about then this idea that I call developing a family owner's manual. And there's lots of people, you can go to any of your estate lawyers or probably your financial advisors and ask them for a red file checklist or an in case of emergency checklist. The idea of this owner's manual is to get past the what and where and get to the how and why. And it's a really interesting, I think, thing for families to be able to leave as an educational roadmap or to question their own planning and their own judgment. And so we'll talk about that next time around. So I think with that, see if there's any other questions, and thank you all for listening.
Well, we have a couple of questions. One person asks, I want to read a little about this area of work. Can you point me in the right direction?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if we have an ability to distribute kind of a reading list or anything, but I would start with, if this is really an area you're interested in, Jay Hughes, as an author, has written a number of books. There's one called Family Wealth that's really great and will give you a pretty good overview of the whole space. There's, let's see. There's another book that Jay is a co-author on called Cycle of the Gift, and really talks about some of this multi-generational aspects of this. And I'll check with Marcia if we have any way of distributing a reading list of some kind, but we can certainly make some other recommendations. But those are a couple of really good start.
How about in part 2, we'll put together a reading.
Sure, a resource list. Sure, yeah. That'd be great.
Another question, how old do my kids have to be in order to get started in this kind of work?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think, again, as I started to say earlier with respect to the who's in the room, that it's really, I would say it's never too early. Some families are starting this with very young kids and doing kind of here's your allowance and here's the amount that you need, to give away, and the amount that you need to save, and the amount you can go buy, if it was my generation, the amount you can go down to the dime store and spend on bubblegum. So I think it really depends on the family and what they are after. I would say certainly by the time, your kids are in their teens, it's pretty easy to involve them. We involved our kids as teens in some philanthropic decisions and created a program for that whole generation to work on together. When people really want to reveal more and more about the financial side of the family, obviously depends on, each family, what their concerns are. I think what's interesting is I'd love somebody to study whether there's an age. I think there's a shift between the point at which we as parents are like, no, I don't want to tell them too much because I'm worried about ruining them or disincentivizing them from hard work, to all of a sudden, when does the light switch go to, oh gosh, I need to be preparing these kids for what's going to land on their plate? And I don't know where that demarcation point is. It's obviously different for every family, but I think it's a really interesting question as to where you go over that. I would argue that most parents, in my personal view, tend to carry the I'm worried about ruining my kids far longer than is really appropriate or necessary, because chances are, and obviously there's exceptions to everything, chances are by the time your kids are launched and are in their own careers, their value set is pretty well baked. And if it's not, maybe you need to look in the mirror a little bit and figure out why it's not. But the reality is, once that value set's pretty baked, I mean, obviously, if you're about to say to them, I'm going to hand you $1 billion, maybe that's going to okay, well, even I would stop working. So, but nevertheless, I think, you've got to look at that pretty individually, and it's both about age and content. And so it's really making sure that that's age appropriate content as you're bringing that in. But the more you can routinize the idea of showing up to family meetings, even if somebody's sitting in the corner on an iPad. I mean, my youngest used to literally sit in the corner on the iPad, but he had to be there. And the more you can kind of routinize that idea that this is part of responsible ownership and stewardship, then it becomes a pretty baked kind of thing. And then you're really talking about content as opposed to whether they're there or not.
Another question has come in. What are some of the biggest mistakes you see families making?
It's a hard one. I think lack of addressing these issues is probably the single biggest mistake. I think when you hear the real horror stories of either families that have blown up or lawsuits that get filed or wealth ruining somebody, it's likely to be back. It goes back to that study. It's likely to be the result of some kind of failure of trust or communication or preparedness. And so, there's a book in the one I mentioned, Cycle of the Gift, that talks about inheritance as a meteor strike. And the idea is that if you haven't done any preparation, here's this meteor strike of wealth that comes into your life. And that can be, frankly, really damaging. I mean, it's hard to imagine how all of a sudden access to money is a bad thing, but nevertheless it is. And so it can be. And so I think the biggest mistake is probably this idea of lack of preparation, of not addressing these issues, of not sharing your wishes as parents or as grandparents or whoever, are the wealth generators or the ones who are passing on to the next generation those values and those ideals. The other analogy that I really like when I see it, and I think is again a similar kind of mistake, it's sort of the same mistake, but is this idea that the typical beneficiary and trustee relationship is like a shotgun wedding. Because the chances are, in most situations, the trustee has not spent any time getting to know that beneficiary and vice versa. And the trust document is a very, stale legal document that for anybody who's read one, it's horrible. I mean, they are just horrible to read. And so you have this situation where, mom or dad just died and you're grieving, and now all of a sudden you've got this new relationship that you have to establish between the beneficiary and the trustee. And all of that can be avoided by this kind of work when it's really thoughtful, when it's really taken seriously, and it's a family-wide endeavor over a long period of time.
Another question has come in. How do I find a facilitator?
It's a great question. There are a lot. I think the first thing I would do is reach out to, if you have wealthy friends, I would ask them if they've done this work. If you have a financial advisor you really like who's on the more holistic side and really believes in all this, I'd ask them if they have somebody they work with. If you have an estate lawyer, same kind of question. If you need recommendations, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to give you recommendations. Most of the people in this space work all across the country or all across the world. It's not necessarily something where you have to have somebody in your backyard. I will say one of the really important things I feel in doing this work is that the entire family has to like that person. This is not something where mom or dad can go say, hey, we're going to go hire Josh or Daniel or Marche to do X, Y, and Z. There's a lot of preparation that goes into it. It's really important that the kids or whoever is going to be in that room have their own relationship. I like to say that this work is often like being a psychologist, except I'm allowed to have an opinion, and I don't, have to be quiet. But I think it's really important that everybody has a relationship with that facilitator, and that they've all sort of mutually agreed, yeah, this is a person we can work with.
Well, I believe that's all the time we have for questions.
Great.
And once again, we will be doing a part 2. So look for a link to that in the follow-up to this email and or to this webinar. We will send out an email with the replay. And we're excited to continue our conversation with you, Josh.
Thank you.
On behalf of Advice Chaser, I do want to thank our speaker. Thank you, Josh, and thank you to our moderator, Daniel, who worked to bring you this webinar today. Thank you so much to our attendees for attending. You're welcome to share the replay that we send out with your friends and family. And as I don't know if I'd mentioned that, but we will host the recording on our YouTube channel as well. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and for your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners is committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming. We will see you at another webinar soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.